Coronations are a declaration of our hopes for the future. And I know she's up there, fondly keeping an eye on us, and she'll be a very proud mother.
Breaking. William shocks everyone with confirmation. On Camilla's future, Charles left stunned. Okay, take a look at this for a moment. Prince William has allegedly confirmed a decision about Camilla's future that King Charles reportedly never expected to hear from his own son. And the timing is what makes this so explosive. The issue was not simply whether Camilla would continue appearing in public. According to the reported palace scenario, confidential plans were already being examined over her future duties, her public role, and what would happen when the next reign eventually began. Then William stepped forward, before the palace appeared ready. Now watch this carefully, because this is where the story becomes much bigger than Camilla. The reported confirmation threatened to expose a palace decision that had been handled behind closed doors, while Charles was still expecting to control when the matter became public. And if William really confirmed it before his father was prepared, then this was not just a disagreement between a king and his heir. It was a warning about who would control the monarchy after Charles. So the question hanging over the palace was brutally simple. Why would William risk shocking his own father by confirming something concerning Camilla's future before the palace had finished preparing its announcement? Was he forcing a decision into the open, or was he making it clear that the next reign would operate by rules Charles had never intended to impose? Hi viewers, if you were in William's position and knew something this important was being kept behind closed doors, would you speak up before everyone else was ready? Leave a simple yes or no in the comments, because that answer says a lot about where you stand when the truth is being kept quiet. And this is precisely where the alleged palace crisis began to tighten. Senior advisors had reportedly been examining Camilla's future position, including her official duties, public appearances, staff arrangements, and the wider structure that could surround her after Charles's reign. On paper, each issue looked administrative. Nothing appeared explosive. But together, those details raised a much more uncomfortable question. What happens to a queen consort when the king she serves is no longer on the throne? That question carried enormous weight, because the palace was allegedly not discussing whether Camilla would suddenly cease to matter. The concern was more specific. Would she automatically retain the institutional machinery connected to Charles's reign? Would staff continue around her? Would communications remain attached to her? Would residences associated with royal work continue operating as before? And could those arrangements eventually create another center of influence beside the next sovereign? That was the possibility William reportedly found increasingly difficult to ignore.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change. Not overly radical change, but changes that I think need to happen.
The most striking part of the alleged proposal was that it did not need to attack Camilla personally. There was no need to question her dignity, no need to erase her from royal life, no need to pretend that her years beside Charles had never happened. The proposed boundary was colder than that. The next reign would belong to the next sovereign, and that single idea had consequences far beyond one woman. Inside the palace, the language surrounding the issue was reportedly being kept deliberately restrained. Advisors were not talking about humiliation. They were talking about transition. They were not talking about punishment. They were talking about continuity. They were not openly discussing Camilla's removal. They were examining what should happen to the institutional structure surrounding her when Charles was no longer king. That distinction mattered because William knew exactly how the story could be interpreted. The moment Camilla's future became the subject of a major royal decision, old family wounds could be dragged back into the spotlight. Diana's name could return. Charles's marriage could become part of the argument. Catherine could be accused of pushing Camilla aside. William could be portrayed as using the crown to settle a private family score. And William reportedly understood that danger. He did not want a decision about the future monarchy to look like revenge from the past. But
I want to create a world in which my son is proud of what we do. In a world and a job that actually does impact people's lives for the better.
then Catherine reportedly raised the question that changed the entire calculation. If the principle was truly about protecting the next reign, could it apply to her too? That question left William facing something much more uncomfortable than a dispute over Camilla. Because if Catherine was willing to accept the same restriction herself, then the argument could no longer easily be dismissed as an attack on Charles's wife. It would become something much larger, a rule, a boundary, a line between family and institutional authority. And that was exactly what made the alleged confirmation so dangerous for Charles. His son was not simply questioning what happened to Camilla. William was reportedly preparing to redefine what happens to every surviving royal consort when one reign gives way to another. For Charles, that meant confronting a future he had spent decades waiting to inherit, but perhaps had never imagined in quite this way. A future where the crown would belong to William. A future where William's household would become the center of royal authority. And a future where Camilla's position could no longer depend automatically on the structure Charles had built around his own reign. The deeper the palace examined the proposal, the harder it became to separate Camilla's future from the future of the monarchy itself. Staff, communications, residences, official appearances, and public duties were all connected. Change one part, and another part begins to move. Then one residence emerged as the question nobody could avoid: Clarence House. Its name carried history, memory, and institutional weight. For Charles, it was not simply a building, it represented a model of royal life in which a former queen could remain an important public figure long after her husband's reign had ended. That precedent made the discussion far more personal. Because if William's principle was real, then Clarence House could not simply continue by assumption. And that was the moment the alleged palace plan stopped looking like a private arrangement concerning Camilla and started looking like a direct challenge to an entire royal tradition. William now had a choice. He could allow the palace to manage the announcement quietly, wait for Charles to approve the timing, and let the advisors shape the public message. Or he could confirm the decision himself. According to the scenario surrounding this story, he chose the second path. That is why Charles was reportedly left stunned. Not simply because the future of Camilla was being questioned, not simply because his son disagreed with him, but because William had allegedly stepped into the most sensitive part of the transition and made the future impossible to keep hidden. And once that confirmation was out, the palace could no longer pretend this was only about Camilla. Because behind the closed doors, a much bigger question was already waiting. Who would control the monarchy when Charles's reign ended? And the answer William and Catherine were reportedly preparing was about to force Charles to confront the future before he was ready for it. If that decision matters to you, do not look away now, because the next part is where Catherine's own future becomes tied to Camilla's. And what happened next reportedly made Charles realize this was far worse than he first thought. Catherine was not looking at Camilla's schedule when the question first became impossible to ignore. She was studying a transition briefing, and one section stopped her long enough to read it twice. The material described what happened when one reign ended and another began. Then she reached the part that dealt with a surviving royal consort. The example on the page was familiar. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had remained a major public figure after the death of King George VI. She had lived at Clarence House, maintained staff, carried patronages, attended engagements, and remained deeply visible during Queen Elizabeth II's reign. For decades, that arrangement had looked like continuity. Catherine saw something else. She saw a structure that had been created for a very different family. That distinction mattered. The Queen Mother had been the new Queen's mother. Camilla was William's stepmother. Catherine would eventually become Queen beside William. Those relationships were not interchangeable, and neither were the pressures surrounding them. Catherine was not asking whether Camilla deserved respect. She was asking whether an arrangement built around one royal family should automatically become the template for another. She turned to the advisors and asked a direct question. Would Camilla have her own household after Charles? The room reportedly became quiet. That silence told Catherine more than a long explanation could have done. A household was not merely a collection of assistants. It could mean advisors, communications staff, scheduling teams, invitations, briefings, residences, patronages, and access. Each part could appear harmless on its own. Together, they could preserve a level of institutional influence long after the reign that created it had ended. That was the concern. If a former consort retained all of those structures automatically, where would the previous reign stop and the new reign begin? Catherine did not need an answer immediately. She needed the question tested properly. She asked what would happen to official communications, which staff would remain, which patronages belonged personally to Camilla, and which existed because she served beside the reigning sovereign. Could she continue appearing at public events without creating uncertainty over who spoke for the monarchy? Could a residence remain connected to a former royal household without gradually becoming another headquarters? The advisors could not reduce those questions to one simple answer.
Stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit. But in terms of, you know, doing the job and things like that, I don't feel too overwhelmed by that.
Catherine understood why. A royal transition was not like changing an office manager. People had loyalties, staff had relationships, residences carried history, charities expected continuity. The public became attached to familiar faces. Even a carefully planned transition could create confusion if old structures continued simply because nobody had decided when they should end. But Catherine saw another danger. Continuity could become entitlement. That was the point she wanted William to confront. When she raised the matter with him, William reportedly resisted the idea of touching Camilla's future so directly. He knew the accusations would arrive before any explanation could catch up. Critics could say he was targeting his stepmother. Others could drag Diana back into the conversation. Catherine herself could be accused of wanting Camilla diminished before taking the throne. William knew that story would be easy to tell. It would also be almost impossible to control. Catherine therefore changed the question. Instead of asking what should happen to Camilla, she asked what should happen to any surviving consort. That small change transformed the entire discussion. A rule aimed at one person could look vindictive. A rule applied to everyone could become institutional policy. William listened. Catherine then pushed the argument further. If William became king and she eventually survived him, would she expect his household to remain hers? Would she expect his staff to continue answering to her? Would she expect an independent communications operation because the public still wanted to hear from her? Would she expect a residence associated with their reign to become her permanent base of influence? Her answer was no. That was the moment William reportedly stopped treating the issue as a technical question about Camilla. Catherine was willing to place herself under the same boundary. She understood what that meant. If William died before her and George became king, she would still be George's mother. She could remain loved, respected, and involved in family life. She could continue causes that mattered to her. She could appear publicly when invited, but she would not expect George to inherit the crown while also inheriting an institutional structure built around her. That was the distinction Catherine wanted written into the future. Family could survive a change of reign. Institutional authority had to belong to the sovereign. The argument carried a personal cost for her, and that was precisely why it became difficult for William to dismiss. Catherine was not demanding a privilege for herself, while denying one to Camilla. She was proposing that nobody should receive automatic institutional power simply because a previous reign had placed it around them. That principle also changed how William could speak about Camilla. He did not have to argue that Camilla had done something wrong. He did not have to question her service. He did not have to reopen old family wounds. He only had to establish a boundary between personal standing and royal authority. That boundary became the foundation of the proposal. And it created a much more serious question for Charles. If the principle was applied consistently, then the end of his reign would not simply mean a change of monarch. It would mean the automatic end of the institutional household attached to his reign. That was a much bigger decision than changing Camilla's diary. It touched the machinery of the crown itself. Catherine knew the palace would need to remove every phrase that sounded personal. No reference to Diana, no criticism of Camilla, no suggestion that Charles had made a mistake, no language that could be interpreted as revenge. The document would have to survive without any of those names. It would need to say one thing clearly. When the next sovereign takes the throne, the next sovereign controls the working household. That was the line Catherine wanted. And once William understood it, the discussion moved from whether Camilla should lose something to whether the monarchy should stop automatically carrying one reign into another. That was a far more difficult question to defeat. Because if William rejected the principle, he would eventually have to explain why the next sovereign should inherit not only the crown, but also the institutional expectations of the person who came before him. Catherine had placed the issue in front of him without offering an easy escape. If it applied to Camilla, it had to apply to Catherine. If it applied to Catherine, it had to apply to future consorts. And if it applied to future consorts, then this was no longer a decision about one woman. It was the beginning of a rule that could outlive every person currently sitting at the table. That was when William reportedly asked advisors to test the idea from every direction. That question carried more weight than its 4 words suggested. Clarence House was not an ordinary address. It represented decades of royal continuity and a model Charles understood personally. If the residents remained attached to the previous household, the proposed rule could become meaningless. If its institutional role changed, the break with tradition would become visible to everyone. And Charles was about to hear that argument himself. And one question soon became impossible to avoid. What would happen to Clarence House when the old reign finally ended? If you believe William should be judged by the same rule he expects others to follow, stay with this story, because the next confrontation takes that principle straight into Charles's private world. By 6:25 that evening, the question had moved from a briefing room into Windsor Castle. Charles had been told the meeting concerned future transition arrangements. Nothing about that description suggested a confrontation. There was no warning that his son and Catherine were about to place a document in front of him that could alter assumptions surrounding the end of his reign. Then Charles entered the private sitting room. William was already there. Catherine sat beside him. Between them was the folder. Charles noticed it immediately. He had seen enough royal paperwork to know that the appearance of a folder meant little. The wording inside mattered. But when Catherine opened it, the atmosphere changed before anyone explained why. William did not reach for the pages. Catherine did. That small movement carried a message Charles could not miss. This was not William arriving alone with a personal complaint. Catherine had been involved in preparing what he was about to hear. Charles began reading. The proposal was written without emotional language. There was no attack on Camilla, no criticism of her marriage, no demand that she withdraw from public life. Instead, the document described the structure of the next reign. One sovereign, one central household, one chain of institutional authority. Charles continued reading, and the consequences became harder to ignore. If Camilla survived Charles, her personal position would not simply disappear. The proposal did not claim that she would cease being family or lose every connection to public life, but it challenged the assumption that the machinery surrounding her would continue automatically. Staff would not automatically transfer. Communications would not automatically remain attached to her. A working office would not automatically become permanent. A royal residence would not automatically continue functioning as a separate center of activity. Everything would have to be reviewed under the authority of the next sovereign. Charles looked up. For the first time, the meaning behind the paperwork was becoming clear. "This is about Camilla," he reportedly said. William did not answer defensively. "It affects Camilla," he explained. Catherine then made the distinction sharper. "It is about the next reign." That answer reportedly unsettled Charles more than an argument would have. He had expected disagreement over his wife. What he was hearing instead was a proposed boundary around the entire institution he would eventually leave behind. Charles returned to the page. The principle looked simple. Its consequences were not. A former consort could remain respected. She could retain family connections. She could continue selected causes. She could attend events when invited. But the institutional authority of the previous reign would not follow her automatically into the next. Charles knew immediately what that meant for the woman beside him. Then he asked the question that had been waiting underneath the entire meeting. What happens to Clarence House? The room went quiet. This was no longer an abstract discussion about staff or future schedules. Clarence House carried history that Charles understood personally. It had been associated with the Queen Mother for decades, and that precedent had demonstrated how a royal widow could remain publicly significant after her husband's reign ended. For Charles, that model had never seemed contradictory. The sovereign changed. The family continued. A former queen remained visible. The institution absorbed the transition. But William's proposal was challenging the automatic part of that arrangement. William looked directly at his father. Nothing would continue simply because it had existed before. That included the house if its function remained tied to the previous royal structure. Charles leaned back. The issue was suddenly personal. He had spent years waiting to become king. He understood succession as a reality that would eventually arrive. But hearing his son describe the machinery of the monarchy after his own reign forced him to picture something different. Charles would no longer be the center. William would. And if Camilla remained alive, her future would depend on the arrangements created by William rather than the assumptions established during Charles's reign. Charles's concern was not only institutional. He was thinking about Camilla. What would happen to her if he were gone? Would she be left without the support system that had surrounded her for years? Would the palace expect her to step away? Would William decide what parts of her public life could continue? Charles looked at his son and reportedly asked what protection would exist for her. William's answer was careful. Camilla would not need protection from the next sovereign simply because she was his father's widow. That response carried a harder meaning. William was separating protection from authority. He was saying that Camilla could remain part of the family without becoming a second center of royal power. Charles did not immediately accept that distinction. He had watched royal widows remain important. He had lived through the Queen Mother era. He knew how much continuity could matter to the public, especially during periods of change. William understood that argument, but he also saw the risk. If every previous royal household remained institutionally alive, then every new sovereign could inherit a crown surrounded by old structures, old loyalties, and old expectations. The next reign might begin with two centers of gravity. One would belong to the new king. The other would belong to the household that refused to disappear. That was precisely what William wanted to prevent. Catherine remained quiet while the two men confronted the issue. She knew the next sentence would determine whether Charles could dismiss the proposal as an attack on Camilla. Then she spoke. "It applies to me too." Charles turned toward her. He had not expected that. Catherine explained that if William died before her and George became king, she would accept the same boundary. She would not expect George to inherit the crown and also inherit an institutional court built around his mother. No automatic staff. No inherited communications structure. No permanent royal headquarters simply because she had once been queen. Charles listened. The argument had changed again. Catherine was not asking Charles to accept a rule that she intended to escape. She was accepting the possibility that the same rule could one day affect her. That removed the simplest accusation. This was not necessarily about pushing Camilla aside. It was about deciding where one reign ended. Charles looked back at the folder. The pages contained no reference to Diana, no reference to old family grievances, no language designed to humiliate Camilla. The proposal had been stripped of anything that could make it sound personal. That was what made it more difficult to attack. Charles could challenge the principle. He could question the precedent. He could argue that continuity mattered, but he could no longer easily claim that William and Catherine had created the rule solely for Camilla. Then Charles asked about the practical details. Who would control communications? Who would determine which staff remained? Which patronages would continue? What would happen to residences connected to royal work? William explained that those decisions would belong to the reigning sovereign. That answer gave Charles the clearest picture yet of what his son was proposing. The previous reign would end. The next reign would begin. And the machinery would move with the crown. Charles sat silently for several seconds. The man who had entered the room expecting a discussion about future arrangements was now looking at the possible architecture of the monarchy after him. But there was still one question Charles had not asked. If the rule truly applied to everyone, how far would William take it? Because somewhere inside the palace, another name had already entered the discussion. And the next person connected to this principle was not Camilla. It was Catherine herself. The answer would force Charles to confront just how far his son's proposed boundary could reach. Yet Charles still believed there was another possibility. Perhaps William was describing a principle in theory while leaving room for the old arrangements to survive in practice. That assumption would not last long. The folder contained another page, and before the meeting ended, Charles would discover why William had brought Catherine into the room that night. If this matters to you, do not let the palace controversy pass without hearing what happened next, because the next part puts Camilla directly in front of William and Catherine, and the decision becomes far more personal. At 7:10 that evening, the door opened, and Camilla walked into a room where the decision about her future had already been made. She did not need anyone to tell her something was wrong. Charles was unusually quiet. William was sitting forward, his expression controlled. Catherine remained beside the open folder, with another page waiting underneath the first. Camilla looked from one face to another. What has happened? William stood. He did not begin with accusations, history, or family grievances. He began with the future. The proposal was simple to describe and difficult to absorb. When the next reign eventually began, there would be one sovereign at the center of the institution and one principal working household supporting that sovereign. Other members of the royal family could remain visible and respected, but no separate court would continue automatically simply because it had existed during the previous reign. Camilla understood the implication almost immediately. And me? The question reportedly landed harder than any formal statement could have. Catherine answered before the room could become defensive. You remain family. Camilla looked at her. But not royal? Catherine did not accept that wording. The distinction mattered. The proposal did not erase Camilla's place within the family, nor did it declare that her public life would suddenly end. She could continue causes that mattered to her. She could attend family occasions. She could appear publicly when invited by the reigning sovereign. What would change was the machinery around her, the staff, the communications operation, the official scheduling structure, the institutional access. The assumption that those arrangements would continue simply because Charles had once approved them. Camilla listened carefully. Then she turned toward Charles. "So when you are gone, I disappear." Charles looked at William, but William answered first. "No." William then explained the distinction that had driven the entire proposal. Disappearing and losing automatic institutional authority were not the same thing. Camilla could remain part of national life without operating a second court beside the new king. She could remain respected without becoming another source of official direction. That distinction was the heart of the decision. Family was not the same as government. Camilla sat still. For years, her public role had been tied closely to Charles. Her engagements, patronages, receptions, briefings, and official appearances had formed part of the working structure of his reign. The proposal did not erase those years. It questioned whether the structure supporting them should automatically survive him. Camilla looked at Catherine again. There was no visible celebration in Catherine's expression, no satisfaction. Instead, Catherine appeared to understand the personal cost of what was being proposed. She repeated the point that had changed William's thinking. If William died first and George became king, she would accept the same rule. She would remain George's mother. She would remain part of the family. She could continue work she personally cared about, but she would not expect George to preserve a separate Catherine household around her. She would not expect William's staff to remain under her command. She would not demand an independent communications operation because she had once been queen. Camilla watched her closely. That admission changed something in the room. Catherine was not asking Camilla to surrender a privilege that Catherine intended to keep for herself. She was accepting the same boundary. Charles saw it too. His wife had entered, expecting to hear what would happen to her. Instead, she was being shown a rule that Catherine was prepared to live under herself. Camilla then asked the practical question, "Who decides?" William answered immediately, "The sovereign." That answer carried the entire principle. If a future king wanted Camilla involved, he could invite her. If he wanted her to continue particular patronages, he could support them. If he wanted her at major events, he could include her. But the authority would come from the reigning monarch. It would not come automatically from precedent. It would not come automatically from history. It would not come automatically because she had once stood beside Charles. Camilla understood that her future would contain uncertainty. Under William's proposed structure, every role would depend on the needs and decisions of the sovereign who followed. She looked toward Charles again. He had spent years building a working monarchy with her beside him. Now the proposal was telling both of them that the structure of that reign belonged to that reign. Charles remained silent. Camilla did not raise her voice. She did not reject the proposal immediately. Instead, she asked another question. Was this rule only for widows of kings? William said the principle was broader. Would it apply to every future surviving consort? William confirmed that was the intention. A future sovereign could still invite a former consort into public work, support selected patronages, and include that person at major events. But would the previous household have an automatic claim to continue? Number. Camilla looked down at the document. For the first time, the proposal was no longer simply about what she might lose. She was beginning to understand what William believed the monarchy needed to prevent. A former consort could remain important without becoming a second center of institutional authority. That was the boundary. But William had not finished. He turned the first page over. A second sheet was lying underneath it. Camilla had not seen it when she entered. At the top was a heading that changed the scale of the conversation. The principle was not written only for Charles's reign. It was designed to survive it. Camilla began reading. Her name was not presented as the sole subject. Catherine's position was included. Future consorts were included. The structure was written broadly enough to apply beyond the people sitting around that table. That meant the proposal could not easily be dismissed as a temporary measure aimed at one queen. It was being presented as a succession principle. When one reign ended, the institutional household attached to that reign would end with it. The next sovereign would decide what continued. Camilla read the page again. Then she looked at Charles. The king now had a different problem. If he defended the old arrangement only because it protected Camilla, he risked making the entire discussion personal. If he challenged the principle itself, he would have to explain why a new sovereign should inherit institutional structures created by the previous one. Charles did not answer immediately. Catherine remained still. William waited. Everyone in the room understood that the proposal had moved beyond one marriage, one household and one future queen. It concerned what happened every time the crown passed from one generation to another. Camilla finally asked whether a future king could reverse the principle. William's answer was carefully limited. A sovereign would always have authority to shape the household of his own reign. The document was not intended to control George from beyond William's lifetime. It was intended to prevent a previous household from possessing an automatic claim over George's. Camilla absorbed the distinction. The future could still include her, but it would not belong to her by right of Charles's previous reign. Charles finally closed the page, and Charles understood that immediately. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The meeting had reached the point where there was no easy victory for anyone. William could not pretend the decision was painless. Catherine could not pretend she was exempt from it. Camilla could not pretend the old assumptions were untouched. And Charles could no longer reduce the matter to a personal dispute involving his wife. Then William introduced one final name, Princess Anne. She had already been asked whether this principle would weaken continuity. Her answer, according to the account, had focused on one thing. The next king had to be allowed to be king. That response gave William the institutional support he needed. But it also raised a new question. If Anne accepted the principle, what would Charles do with it? The answer was about to become even more uncomfortable, because after Camilla left the room, Charles would no longer ask William about Camilla. He would ask about Catherine. If this matters to you, stay with the story, because the next part turns the entire argument back on William himself, and what Charles asks him could expose the one weakness nobody in that room was ready to confront. Charles waited until the room had emptied before asking the question that changed the entire meaning of the night. He looked at William and asked whether he had truly considered what the same rule could mean for Catherine. It was the one question William could not answer as an abstract constitutional problem. Catherine was not a distant possibility. She was the woman beside him, the future queen, and the mother of the children who would inherit whatever structure he created. If William died before her and George became king, Catherine could one day face the exact boundary now being discussed. William did not retreat from it. He reportedly admitted that the thought was painful, but pain, in his view, could not determine where institutional authority belonged. If George became sovereign, George would need the freedom to build his own reign. Catherine could remain his mother, remain respected, remain publicly active, and remain part of the family. What she could not expect was automatic control over the machinery of William's former reign. That answer left Charles silent. For the first time, the king was no longer listening as Camilla's husband. He was listening as a father whose son had accepted a principle that could affect Catherine. That was the strength of Catherine's position. She had not asked William to impose a sacrifice she would never face herself. She had placed her own future under the same rule. That detail changed the moral balance of the entire dispute. Whatever people might think about Camilla, Catherine's position could not easily be dismissed as personal hostility. She was accepting the possibility that one day her own public influence would have to give way to the authority of her son's crown. The question then became whether Charles could accept that principle before William made it public. The following morning, Friday, August 14th, William and Catherine reviewed the final wording. The document had been stripped of phrases that could turn the proposal into a family attack. There was no mention of Diana. There was no criticism of Camilla. There was no accusation against Charles. Instead, the wording focused on succession, institutional authority, and the beginning of a new reign. William signed first. Catherine then read the wording again before adding her signature. There was no celebration. The significance was too serious for that. They had signed a principle that could eventually apply to themselves, their children, and generations they would never meet. That was why the proposal carried consequences beyond Charles and Camilla. The Queen Mother precedent had shown that a surviving royal widow could remain one of the most recognizable figures in Britain long after her husband's death. Her public role had become part of the monarchy's visual memory. Clarence House had become connected to that era. William's proposed structure did not erase that history. It challenged the assumption that history automatically becomes precedent for every future reign. That distinction was critical. That was the point Charles could no longer dismiss as a private family matter. A future sovereign could preserve parts of the old arrangement. The difference was that the choice would belong to the new sovereign. Nothing would transfer simply because it had existed before. That was the point Charles had been forced to confront at Windsor, and it was also why William's alleged confirmation carried such weight. If he had remained silent, palace advisors could have continued shaping the announcement. Charles could have controlled the timing. The public could have been given a prepared explanation. But once William confirmed the decision, the palace had a different problem. The future was no longer something that could be discussed privately. It had become something the public could judge. Supporters could see William's move as a cleaner succession structure. Critics could see it as a confrontation with his father and stepmother. Others could question whether breaking with tradition would strengthen the monarchy. Those arguments were now unavoidable. Charles's stunned reaction made sense because the confirmation did more than reveal a policy. It exposed the direction of the next reign. William was effectively telling the public that the monarchy after Charles would not simply reproduce Charles's household, it would be built around the sovereign who inherited the crown. That meant Camilla's future would depend on the choices of the next king. It also meant Catherine's future would eventually depend on George. The rule had therefore moved beyond personalities. It had become a statement about succession itself. But one issue still remained unresolved. Clarence House. That residence had become the symbol of the entire dispute because it represented the question William had not fully answered. If there was one working household under the next sovereign, what happened to a residence historically associated with a former royal household? Would Camilla continue using it? Would its staff answer to William? Would it remain a private family residence while losing its institutional role? Would the next king decide its future? Those questions were not minor administrative details. They were the practical test of whether the principle was real. Words on a document could be interpreted in different ways. A building could not. If Clarence House changed hands, changed staff, or changed function, the public would see the new structure immediately. That is why the residence remained the most dangerous unanswered question surrounding the alleged decision. William could announce a principle, but implementing it would require decisions involving people who had spent years inside the existing system. Staff would have loyalties, charities would have expectations, royal engagements would have histories. Any transition would create difficult conversations. The palace would have to decide which relationships belonged to Charles personally and which belonged to the crown. Charles understood that. William understood it too. And Catherine understood the personal consequences better than anyone because she had voluntarily placed herself inside the rule. That may have been the most important detail of the entire story. The controversy began with Camilla. It ended with a question about whether any royal, no matter how popular or respected, should automatically carry institutional authority from one reign into another. That is why William's reported confirmation became so explosive. He was not simply confirming something about Camilla. He was confirming what he believed the next monarchy should look like. And that is also why Charles was reportedly stunned. He had spent years preparing to shape the crown according to his own vision. Yet the moment his son confirmed the future arrangement, Charles was forced to confront a reality every sovereign eventually faces. The next reign belongs to the next sovereign. The answer on Clarence House may determine whether that principle remains a document or becomes the clearest visible break with the old royal model. So if this story has made you question who should control the future of the monarchy, do not stay silent. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the royal family, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications. Your support is how this story keeps being examined, instead of being buried beneath the palace noise. And stay close, because the next video coming on this channel goes even deeper, and what comes next could be worse, more revealing, and far more interesting than what has already been exposed.